these tariff wars that Trump has unveiled, it has triggered fears of recession. And many experts believe that definitely there is a possibility, if US, China and others don't scale back, and if they don't bring normalcy back, and if the current instability and chaos continues, there is every possibility that it could further scare away the investors. It could lead to larger disruption of the supply chains and push the world into a much deeper and longer recession. So given the scale of this impact, how it affects each and every one of us, it's important to understand on what logic, on what rationale did Trump decide to impose such tariffs. Given the scale of the disruption which is being caused, one would assume that there is a lot of thought which has gone into it. When such a big decision has been made, right, we would naturally assume that the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful government in the world, would have put a lot of thought behind such a decision. But it turns out that's not the case. I know you might be shocked, but there is very little logic and absolutely no rationale in the kind of tariffs that have been levied by the Trump administration. See, Trump has been under the assumption that trade deficit is a bad thing. Trump has always believed that a trade imbalance which goes against the US is in itself a bad thing for American economy. But that is not the case. That's not how the global economy works. In fact, the trade deficit was created by the US itself as a matter of deliberate policy. Because see, manufacturing in the US at one point became very expensive and cost prohibitive. The labor cost had increased, material cost had gone up. There was no point in manufacturing in the US. So that is one reason why the US pioneered globalization, especially from 1990s onwards, to basically outsource manufacturing and outsource the production outside of the US. It was primarily Asian economies which benefited from this, led by China from 1980s. China opened its doors to American investments, where American companies, manufacturing companies shifted out, set up factories in China. These are special economic zones that China was establishing. And as China embraced this form of capitalism, despite being a communist country, it became the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Eventually, other Asian economies, from Vietnam to Cambodia, to even India, and even the developed Asian economies, Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, etc., they all benefited from the American policy of pushing manufacturing out of the country. Because in the Asian economies and in these manufacturing-led driven economies, the cost of labor was much cheaper, relatively, compared to the US.
लेबर कॉस्ट तो ऑब्वियस है, इंडिया में तो भाई बहुत चीप है, अमेरिका में तो बहुत ज़्यादा महंगा है।
So it was convenient for American businesses,
लेबर्स के लिए अच्छा है, मतलब लेबर्स इन द सेंस हम लोग भी लेबर ही हैं भाई।
It was primarily
लेबर
for the
लॉज
sake
में ही
of
आते
American
हैं।
consumers that manufacturing was pushed out of the US. The US realized it is cheaper to import than to produce the same goods within the American economy. So that is what led to the shift of manufacturing towards Asia. But of course, the average Americans did lose their jobs. The middle class Americans, especially those working in factories, steel factories, automobile factories, the farmers in the United States, their livelihoods were disrupted. Those especially working in manual labor, they did lose their jobs, creating resentment, creating a lot of resentment.
एक पॉलिसी से सोचो कि कितना इफेक्ट आता है, ये ट्रम्प का पॉलिसी दिखा देता है। A single policy, how can it affect the administration? How can it affect the global economy?
And given the position of the dollar, right? US always enjoyed a competitive edge. It could basically procure cheaply produced goods at a very competitive cost, and in a way US benefited from this, and it could provide affordable goods and consumer goods and products to its consumers because manufacturing was being done outside of the country. So it's not that trade deficit happened on its own, or it's not that China and others deliberately manipulated the markets to hurt American interests. It was rather US itself which tried pushing out manufacturing in order to reduce the cost of production and thereby benefit from the cheaper labor and cheaper markets available in other countries.